The Ming dynasty in China ran from the middle of the 1300s to the middle of the 1600s. That means that it covers a period which in European history would be considered the late medieval period and Renaissance. That means that at that time that Europeans were using swords like this or this, the Chinese were using completely different types of weapons. And at this time, the most famous military style of sword being used was the Dao, like this example here, which we'll look at in a future video. Like this shark's head Dao here with a clipped point. And these swords bear a lot of similarities to European falchions and messer. And while these Chinese Dao, which are equivalent really to messers or falchions, are incredibly versatile swords, they were the preferred military sword for reasons which aren't entirely clear. However, they weren't the only types of swords being used at the time. While the Dao is really defined as being single-edged, it can actually be slightly curved or straight. Sometimes they have a clipped point on them. They are single-edged swords. But despite their popularity and success, sometimes this straight double-edged sword, the JIAN, was still used in the time of the Ming and Qing dynasties. So we're going to look here at this amazing particular disc guard style of JIAN and find out who used these and why. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I just want to thank LK Chen and KK specifically from LK Chen for giving these swords to the channel so that I can make videos about Chinese weapons for you. Now, Chinese swords aren't really well covered in Western literature, but thankfully I've had a lot of help with translations and other extracts from Chinese material giving me some information about these. And there are experts out there running other channels who you can look to for Chinese sword material as well. But we're going to look at here the straight double-edged JIAN, which a lot of people think kind of went out of use by the time we get to the Ming dynasty. And to a certain extent that's true, but we're going to unpack that in a second. Now I'm just going to put this straight disc guard JIAN away for a second, and I'm going to get out these two Dao. Now we have looked at the Dao before. Both of these will get full reviews. These are both LK Chen's as well. Both of these will get full reviews in another video. But we've looked briefly at why these were so successful in the time of the Ming and Qing dynasties, and there's no question they were. These were, maybe not the Emperor's version, but as a type of sword, these were the most successful and popular military swords of the Ming and Qing eras. But the straight sword, the double-edged sword rather, didn't really go away. It was always present. It just wasn't usually present as a standard military sidearm. Right, so first up, let's look at this. This is modelled on an original antique example that's in LK Chen's collection, I think, or at least a collection he has access to. And this is an exact one-for-one replica of that sword, and it dates to the late Ming dynasty. What does that mean in European dating? So we're really talking here about the 1500s, possibly the early 1600s. Okay, so the Ming dynasty as an entire dynasty runs from the about 1360 something all the way through to 1640 something. However, this is a later Ming dynasty style of sword, but the JIAN had actually been around in various forms for the entire of the Ming dynasty, so from the 14th, 15th, 16th and into the 17th centuries, and this is a later example that's probably mid to late Ming dynasty. Now the straight double-edged blade in itself really hadn't changed since the Han dynasty. This had been around for a long time and never really changed. We still find this in the early 20th century. In fact, we still find it today in various styles of kung fu practice. So the blade really actually doesn't have an awful lot to say about it. It is a simple blade, flattened diamond section, parallel edges. Some of them are more tapered, some of them start off more broad and taper down. This one's more parallel edged with a fairly obtuse point. Some of them are more rounded, some of them are more pointed. This is a slightly more pointed version. But the two main things that you really want to pay attention to with a JIAN of this style is that open work pommel, which to some of you might look quite bizarre and quite unusual if you're not used to Chinese swords, and that disc guard, which to some of you might look quite familiar, as it's somewhat similar to certain styles of sabre that we find on Japanese swords, for example. Now we're going to start out actually with that guard, because in a way it's the simplest element. It is a style of guard which comes about in the Ming dynasty, and in fact we don't find it really after the Ming Dynasty. So for whatever reason and for whatever inspiration, was it partly inspired by Japanese and Korean swords? We don't really know, but it appears in the Ming Dynasty, and it has to be said there are other things which appear in the Ming Dynasty which do seem to have been inspired by Japanese weapons. But this appears in the Ming Dynasty and then doesn't really survive beyond the end of the Ming Dynasty. Okay, so that is a specifically Ming adaptation of the jian, and it's not something we find on earlier jian. And so therefore this really, the second you see this style of straight double-edged sword with a discard, you know it's a Ming Dynasty sword. Now, in terms of the pommel, in fact, in the Ming Dynasty, there are various types of pommels being used. We could probably do a whole video just looking at Ming and Qing Dynasty pommels on different sword types. Some of them are more like a sort of end cap, like we might find on a dao, or a kind of ball shaped. Some of them more the mushroom shaped pommels, which we find on earlier versions of jian and other Chinese sword. And then this style, this open style, is one of the things that denotes this as a late Ming period. So we're talking about 1500s, maybe into the 1600s, this particular open form of pommel. And in fact, generally speaking, the earlier, so if we were looking at an earlier Ming jian, for example, it will probably have a cap or a solid pommel on the end instead of this open formwork. So really, in terms of dating, this type of sword is really almost a contemporary of certain swept hilts in Europe. And it's funny that, you know, in Europe we go for more complex handguards, whereas in China at this time they went for more complex and perhaps symbolic and ornate pommels, quite different to what was going on in Europe, or indeed in Japan, for example. Now, mentioning Japan, one of the parallels here is the grip, as is found on many Chinese swords, is shark skin, shagreen as we call it in Europe. In fact, it's not always shark technically, it can often be ray, like stingray skin, or it can be types of dogfish as well. But anyway, that is real shark skin, or a form of relative of the shark anyway, and it gives an absolutely fantastic grip. Now, I'm a big fan of these types of stippled shark skin grips. Obviously they are Samagawa, it's on Japanese swords underneath the Ito wrap, but this is essentially probably where it stems from. We sometimes even find it on the scabbards as well, not just on the grips, and it gives, number one, an absolutely fantastic grip, but secondly, if your hand is wet, or indeed if the sword gets wet, like if you're at sea for example, it still gives a really good grip, even if your hand's bloody. So it gives a really secure grip, and you can really feel the grip without it being abrasive in your hand. It almost has, to a certain degree, some of the benefits of modern sport wraps, like for tennis wraps and stuff, almost rubbery like, so it really grips in the hand, and I'm a massive fan of it. So, although this is not a standard military sword of the Ming era, for example, the dao of the various styles that you get at this time, it does seem a fairly basic and practical sword, doesn't it? So who were actually using these things? Well, it turns out that all sorts of people were using these, and therefore actually quite a lot of them survive archaeologically and in museums and antique collections in China. But just not the standard military. So while, again, this is a sort of princely version, but while the dao, that in other words, falchion we could call it by European standards, or sabre, while the sabre or falchion was the standard military sword for most soldiers, most standard soldiers, this was carried by some soldiers, specifically very high-ranking generals, or sometimes officers, and indeed state officials. Okay, so anyone who's associated with the structure of government essentially and is higher status, so the equivalent of officers, the equivalent of generals, statesmen, and in civilian life as well. But there's another group of people that often get overlooked when we're talking about weapon design, and that is civilians. The fact is that there were all sorts of people in China, big place, and there are all sorts of people that wanted to have weapons. Famously, there are the martial arts schools, and there have always been active martial arts schools in China. Even in the 19th century, these were known as boxers, which gives us the rise of the Boxer Rebellion. But these weapons were being used for self-defense, for travellers, sometimes perhaps for local militias and sort of sort of police type forces and stuff. So they didn't necessarily have to be military weapons to still essentially be serviceable weapons. And so just because the dao was the preferred weapon of the official military, in fact we actually find the jian still in use at this time by a whole range of people. Some very high status, all the way up to emperors, and some emperors are famously pictured still with the dao, as well as their courtiers and statesmen, as well as very high-ranking generals, sometimes officers, and sometimes lower status jian were carried by just normal civilian people like most of you and me. Now, in fact, one of the most famous jian in a collection today is actually in the Royal Armouries, obviously somewhere I talk about a lot and go to sometimes. And that particular jian was commissioned by the Yongle Emperor, so the third Ming Dynasty Emperor reigning from 1403 to 1424, and it was commissioned for a Tibetan monk, which brings in a couple of other interesting elements about the jian in the Ming Dynasty, because number one, yes, absolutely, it's a sword that could be commissioned or worn by emperors at this time and given as high status gifts. But secondly, it's interesting that it's for Tibetan monk because, as I mentioned, China's a big, big place. And one of the interesting things about swords, it doesn't matter what kind of sword it is that sometimes swords had a, shall we call it, ethnic or regional or geographical reference. So sometimes if someone wanted, and this did happen, to particularly show affinity with the Manchu, for example, they might choose to wear certain types of sword. Whereas, say for example, someone was operating within the sphere of Tibetan politics, they might choose another type of sword. And it's possible that a given high official might have a series of different swords for different occasions and for different diplomatic or political reasons. Of course, we even see parallels with this in the British Empire, where an officer might wear a sabre, generally speaking, but when engaging with a certain Indian princely court, might wear a shamshir or a tulwar. So in the mid-Ming period, we actually have a jian relating to the Jing Emperor, whose personal name was Zhu Hukong, I think it's pronounced, and he was the 12th emperor of the Ming Dynasty, reigning from 1521 to 1567. And we have here a painting of him, showing him going out on an official outing, and the jian is clearly long, and it is built in or designed in the Song style. So it could be an old sword, or it could be representing a specific reason. And it's even possible that this changes over time, the influences on the jian as well, that in the earlier period there seems to be a stronger Tibetan and perhaps Mongolian influence. In the middle period, probably more pure Chinese, and in the later period it's possible that there's an increasing Japanese influence on the design of these as well. And within the LK product line, for example, we have representation of these periods. We've got the so-called fighting bull, early Ming, the duke and sort of minister's jian, which was initially forbidden to regular people and even officials. And the style and design was later approved to be used by sort of first rank, top rank senior ministers. And then the mid-Ming period, we've got again Duke and Minister jian, inspires the Grand Duke in the LK product line. And finally the late Ming period inspires the White Serpent, for example. So to conclude, this straight double-edged sword is called a jian. A single-edged sword, whether it's curved or straight, is called a dao. I think a lot of you watching this channel by this point now know that, but they were completely different designs of sword that had sort of different origins and functions, and the general rule is that the dao was the primary, probably we could say most important and dominant military sword of the Ming and Qing dynasties, so what would be the medieval and Renaissance periods in Europe. However, the idea that the straight jian just sort of disappeared isn't really correct. It was actually used in a bunch of different functions, from the top of society, for example emperors and diplomatic gifts to Tibetan monks, all the way down to martial arts schools and perhaps even local militias and police. And so we do find the straight jian continues through the Ming period, but if you see one with this disc guard like that, then that is a Ming Dynasty example. So we're talking here about probably the 1500s, the 16th century in Europe. And these were really effective fighting weapons, and the fact that they weren't necessarily mainstream military weapons doesn't diminish from their purposefulness and their usefulness in other aspects of self-defense and martial life. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting and useful to watch. I have been Matt Easton, I will of course continue to be, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel soon. Check out the links down below to LK Chen, and thanks once again to KK for sending these things over for me to talk about and review. Those two Dao will feature in upcoming videos as well, and I can tell you they're very different to each other, but they are absolutely sweet handling things and very, very useful weapons historically. But anyway, we'll examine that in the next video. For now, cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.